Well, hello, and let me introduce myself first. I'm Denis Alexander, one of the emeritus directors of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion here in Cambridge. And I want to start just by saying what a privilege it is to participate in your program of activities on science and faith there at Hull Cathedral. I always think it's better not to start immediately with showing one screen, otherwise you hardly know there's a speaker there, but I will now I hope, just share my screen and so we can get started on our topic for today. So let me just get there to the first slide, and hopefully you can see that okay. And our question today, of course, is creation or evolution, do we have to choose? Well, clearly there are several different ways of being faced with choices between things. For example, if I'm offered the choice between a chocolate and a vanilla ice cream, then I really do have to make that difficult choice, and there are no two ways about it. The choice has to be made because these are two competing types of the same kind of thing. But now let's say I'm offered a choice between appreciating the beauty of an ice cream and enjoying its taste. I might want to say that this is a false choice. In reality, I can both appreciate its aesthetic qualities and enjoy its taste, because here the choice is between two different kinds of things. Now, there are clearly some people around who think that the answer to our question today is yes, you really do have to choose. Some of the so-called new atheists think this way, and so Richard Dawkins writes that I pay religions the compliment of regarding them as scientific theories, and I see God as a competing explanation for facts about the universe and life. And so in this account, science and God are seen as offering rival accounts for the reality around us. It has to be either creation or evolution. You can't have both. And as Dawkins once claimed in a TV program quite a few years ago now, Darwin removed the main argument for God's existence. Well, it's curious, I think, that those closest to this sort of Dawkins philosophy of science are the young Earth creationists, who think also that their religious account is in some kind of rivalry with our current scientific understanding. And so, like Dawkins, also think that the answer to our question should be yes. And ironically, this kind of account actually supports Dawkins' propaganda style. For if the evolution word is continually linked with the atheism idea, then eventually people will think that one implies the other. In fact, scientific theories, especially the big theories of science, can often become invested with various ideological and metaphysical beliefs, that is, beliefs that go well beyond science. The typical process is that a big theory in science, like evolution, becomes highly successful, and then various interest groups move in to try and utilize the prestige of the scientific theory in support of their particular ideology. And unfortunately, the end result is that in the public consciousness, the actual meaning of the label given to the theory itself changes. And so we could say theory X, if you like, becomes socially transformed into theory Y. And so in the history of evolutionary theory, we see evolution being used in support of capitalism, communism, racism, militarism, eugenics, feminism, theism, atheism, and many other isms besides, some of them, of course, mutually exclusive. And I think that in itself should warn us that there is a powerful process of social transformation going on here. And I think that process helps to explain much of the conflict over the years that we've been seeing in the public domain on this particular topic, especially in the USA. Maybe this reminds us of Samuel Wilberforce, whose father, William Wilberforce, had close connections with Hull Cathedral. Samuel Wilberforce was the so-called Soapy Sam, who became Bishop of Oxford, and is often remembered for the debate that he supposedly had about evolution in Oxford in 1860. But this was no science-religion debate, but rather a sophisticated scientific critique by the bishop of this new scientific theory published by Darwin only a few months before as The Origin of Species. When Darwin himself read Wilberforce's critique, He commented that it picks out with skill all the most conjectural parts and brings forward well all the difficulties. That debate piece by Wilberforce was published later on in a review in a journal. That's how we know what he was thinking. Well, all new big scientific theories stimulate scientific discussion, and so they should. What I think is so remarkable is the way in which the Anglican Church in particular baptized evolution into a Christian worldview so soon after the publication of The Origin of Species. By the mid-1860s, questions were already appearing in Cambridge University natural science exam papers that assumed the validity of Mr. Darwin's theory. And remember that all teaching here in Cambridge at that time, including, of course, science teaching, was carried out by clerics of the Anglican Church. But let's return to Dawkins' claim that science and religion are somehow competing for the same common ground. Is there a more useful way of looking at the different kinds of insight or explanation that we might have concerning the world around us? I would like to suggest that there is. Imagine for a moment that the book of this complex entity called life is like a cube sliced into many layers, as shown here. And by life, I mean the total sum of all that we experience. We need all the various levels of explanation to do justice to such a complex reality. In reality, it's one book, but our brains are simply not up to the Herculean task of grasping the book in its entirety all at one go. And so the scientific level of understanding tells us how things work and where they come from. The moral and ethical level addresses what we ought to do in the world. The aesthetic level gives insight into our understanding and appreciation of beauty and so forth. One could add many, many more layers or levels. And at the religious level, we're asking questions like, why is there a universe anyway? What breathes fire into the equations? Is there a creator, God? But what I want you to notice is that these various explanatory levels are in no sense rivals to each other. We need them all, I would suggest, to do justice to our own experience as human agents in this world. And such a model does not at all deny the complex interactions between each level. That's why I'm going to put some yellow arrows going up and down there, because these levels are in no way isolated from each other. But it only just points out the obvious, that no one explanatory level is sufficient by itself. So note that in contrast to Dawkins, who thinks that religious explanations are in competition with scientific explanations, this model underlies the fact that this is not in fact the case, but instead religious explanations and insights provide different kinds of narrative that answer different kinds of questions from scientific questions. There are many ways of knowing. And so now let's come back to the question before us. Do we have to choose between creation and evolution? Clearly, to tackle that question properly, we'll first have to decide whether these are referring to two different types of the same kind of thing, as Dawkins would like to suggest, or whether they're in reality two different kinds of narrative that are complementary to each other, as our many-layered cube of life model might suggest. Well, clearly there's a need for clarity in this discussion. And to encourage clarity, it's always a good idea to start by defining one's terms. Excuse me. So what do Christians mean when we talk about creation, and what do biologists mean when we talk about evolution? Let's start with evolution. And my apologies to the biologists listening, because you know this already, but I guess that for some people, biology GCSE, or was it O-level, might be a long time ago, so I'm sure you won't mind if we have here a bit of a refresher. Well, put simply, the theory of evolution is simply the best explanation that we have in science for the origins of all the biological diversity on this planet, and provides a framework within which all current biological research is carried out, a framework shared by people of any faith or none. It was Darwin's brilliance to bring history into biology. It refers to descent with modification, as Darwin liked to call it, the tree of life, the fact that everything is connected by an evolutionary history in which we share the same genetic code, the same basic types of living systems. We're all made from the same dust, from stardust, in which the chemicals that make life feasible, carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, oxygen, were synthesized in the furnaces of second-generation stars. And there's currently no rival theory, although there are certainly big debates about the different mechanisms involved in evolution, which we'll come to in a moment. And the reason that biologists use evolutionary theory every day for their research programs is simply because it explains so much so well. It's a huge amount of data that at first look unconnected when you first look at it, as Darwin did on his voyage around the world in that famous boat, the Beagle. You can see information, data about anatomy and about geology, the fossil record, the geographical distribution of species, especially on islands, genetics, physiology, and vestiges. And then the theory of evolution comes along and it sort of joins them all up like a good theory should. Vestiges, for example, are just one example of history in biology. Let's just give one example of that, like the vestigial pelvis and rear leg bone that you can see in some species of whale. That, of course, evolved from land-living mammals, so that 1 in 500 of these whale species actually have a rear leg that protrudes outside the body wall. You have to look rather carefully with that big yellow arrow down the bottom of the screen there, because it's pretty small. But in fact, we all contain vestiges of our evolutionary past. From a genetic point of view, our own genomes are like genetic fossil museums. Genomes are simply the sum total of all the DNA that we have in every cell of our bodies. And so that DNA contains a genetic record, a fossil record, if you like, in genetics of our evolutionary past. Now, evolutionary theory has come a long way since Darwin, and in its modern form involves 2 key steps which operate together to produce new forms of life. First of all, then, in step 1, variation is introduced into the genomes of living organisms. The genome refers to the sum total of all the genetic information contained in the DNA of a single living thing, as I say. So new variant DNA can be generated by more than a dozen different mechanisms, all of which are random in the sense that their occurrence is not connected to any particular requirement of the organism. Much variation occurs through the process of reproduction, which ensures a continual supply of new variant genomes to the offspring. Other variation is a result of mutations, which change one or more of the genetic letters in the DNA. And then step 2 is the one that Darwin himself discovered, which he called natural selection, whereby the variant organisms produced by the variant genomes are tested out in the workshop of life. The variant organisms that are most successful in being selected to pass on their genomes to subsequent generations will do so because they're best adapted for particular environments. Herbert Spencer invented the term survival of the fittest to refer to the process. And indeed, Darwin himself borrowed the term, but the phrase, I think, misses the most important point. I mean, for sure, a plant or a lion cannot reproduce without first surviving, but it's what we call reproductive success that counts for natural selection. In other words, how many copies of the variant genomes are passed on to the next and to the succeeding generations. So we could summarize evolution in these 3 pithy phrases. GIP, genetic variation happens, individuals are selected, and populations evolve. Now, very small genetic changes can make a big difference in the way animals look and behave. Here we see different dog breeds providing us with a nice example. So here we've got huge differences in morphology and appearance, structure, and so forth, ranging from the 2-pound Chihuahua to the 180-pound English Mastiff. If all today's breeds were somehow only found in the fossil record, then scientists would view them as many separate species, I think, certainly more than the 36 species of dog known in the world today. And yet domestic dogs are all members of the same species. And about 80% of the differences in dog height and weight are explained by variation in just 7 regions of the dog genome. So quite small differences in the genome can actually make large differences in size and appearance of animals. What about speciation? Well, it occurs mainly by what we call allopatric mechanisms, separation of a population into 2 different groups. Let's imagine, for example, that we have a population of snails. Let's call them species A. And let's imagine that one day a river comes down the middle of that population. And so there are two populations now separated by the river. They can't mix, they can't reproduce together. Well, maybe after 100,000 years or so, the river dries out and the separated populations can now mix again. But in the meantime, each population has accumulated a different set of mutations. So maybe they now can't interbreed. And so two new species have formed. And this is speciation involving reproductive isolation. Now, the term macroevolution is often used to describe evolution of one species into another, but this does not necessarily mean that changes have occurred in the organism's genome that are any different in kind from those that occur between individuals within a species. Well, they might do that. For example, speciation in plants often occurs by hybridization, we call it, followed by a doubling of the chromosome number, either induced artificially, as gardeners do, or in the wild, as shown here. For example, here we see the plant Tragopogon in North America, which is speciated many times by this process of chromosomal doubling over the decades. Now, the plants might actually look quite similar, but they can't interbreed. They have become separate species. And in fact, nearly 50% of existing flowering plant species today are thought to have arisen by this process. So rapid speciation of this kind is very common in the plant kingdom. For animals, speciation is generally a bit slower, but can be relatively rapid during what we call adaptive radiation, in which founder animals occupy different ecological niches. For example, there are more than 2,000 species of cichlids in the world. It's a freshwater fish found mainly in the Great Lakes of Africa. 500 of these species have evolved in one lake in particular, Lake Victoria, over the past 100,000 years. Each species has its own particular ecological niche, with its own type of food and size, coloring, and so on. They can't interbreed. They are a separate species. But it happens pretty rapidly. Now notice that in the case of our own evolution, the suggestion is not that we evolved from apes, but rather that we shared a last common ancestor with our first cousin, the chimpanzee, that lived about 6 million years ago. So since that time of divergence, apes have been evolving into all the various kinds of ape, and we likewise have been evolving to many different species of what we call hominins, until finally anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago. Well, that's just a little bit about evolution. We need to move on. What about the Christian doctrine of creation? Well, all I'm going to try and do here is to summarize a very traditional understanding of God as creator, which is based on the huge biblical literature on this topic, plus the writings of the early church fathers, such as Augustine, plus the writings of great thinkers in the history of the church, such as Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, plus the writings of the reformers, such as Calvin a few centuries later, and indeed the reflections of more recent theologians. So what I'm going to talk about here is not some sort of theological response to science in general, or indeed to evolution in particular. It's just what the church has taught and what Christians have believed down the centuries, certainly for many hundreds of years before evolution ever came on the scene. And the picture that emerges is of a God who is the source of all that exists. Everything that exists, apart from God, has only come into existence because God has brought it into existence. So therefore we say God is the origin of all existence. And in this view, existence refers to anything that exists, be they material or immaterial. The laws of nature, quantum vacuums, Higgs bosons, trees, rabbits, the elements of the periodic table, complex equations like the one you see at the bottom of the screen there, you, me, whatever. So if it exists and it's not God, then it must by definition be part of the created order within what we might call this sort of theistic matrix, the theistic matrical way of understanding the world in which we live. Now I realize that some listening to this talk may not believe in the existence of God at all. So my aim in what follows is not to present arguments for God's existence, but rather to explain what Christians mean when we talk about God as creator. One challenge, of course, in this discussion comes from the way in which we use the word create in the English language and then we apply it to God. Because when we human beings make things, we work with already existing material to produce something new. The human act of creating is not the complete cause of what is produced, but God's creative act is the complete cause of what is produced. As the theologian Bill Carroll puts it, God's causality is so different from the causality of creatures that there is no competition between the two. That is, we do not need to limit, as it were, God's causality to make room for the causality of creatures. God causes creatures to be causes. So creation is not essentially some distant event. Rather, it is the ongoing, complete causing of the existence of all that is. At this very moment, were God not causing all that is to exist, there would be nothing at all. Creation concerns, first of all, the origin of the universe, not its temporal beginning. So, in this worldview, creation then is about the existence of things, it's about the meanings of their existence. And speaking of God as creator does not entail the suggestion of some alternative mechanism as to how creation happens compared to that provided by science. For the simple reason that creation is not about that at all. It's actually about how and why anything exists. Exists, that is, in a way that then renders the scientific enterprise possible. And since God is not encompassed or constrained in any way by the present created order in which we find ourselves, what we've referred to as his transcendence, that means that we as human creatures are in no position at all to guess how God might wish to do creation, nor to tell him how he should be doing it. That idea has deep theological roots. As God says, speaking to the prophet Isaiah, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Now, historians of science have often pointed to this sense of the transcendence of God and the consequent radical, what we call contingency of the created order. That's the dependency of the created order upon God's say-so. Historians have pointed to this as one of the great motivations for empiricism, for the experimental method in the history of science as it developed in the early modern period. For no one could simply guess how the created order might work starting from common sense or simple human logic. Had we been visiting this planet 4 billion years ago, when it was just a desolate mass of materials undergoing frequent asteroid bombardment, no one could have predicted that after a 3.8 billion year evolutionary history, it would become the home of saints and sinners. Now, along with the transcendent otherness of God in the biblical literature comes a major insistence on the simultaneous immanence of God in the created order, that moment-by-moment involvement in upholding and sustaining the created order, God's faithfulness being displayed in what we call this gnomic regularity, this law-like behavior of energy and matter, which renders the world coherent and may make so, therefore, the scientific enterprise possible. And this is a Trinitarian immanence in the Christian worldview and way of looking at things. Charles Raven was previously Master of Christ College, Cambridge. This was Charles Darwin's old college, by the way. But Charles Raven was an influential voice in the science-faith dialogue in Britain in the first half of the 20th century. And he put it like this: God as Father was like an artist deciding to create a picture. God the Son was the design on which the work was modeled, and the Holy Spirit was the creative energy in the artist that created the picture. Other analogies might be useful. God's immanence in creation has been likened to the musical composer in relation to a great piece of music, a composer who both composes and conducts at the same time the music of creation. I think all this helps us to understand why what we sometimes call the God of the gaps idea of God is so unsatisfactory. And this is the idea that when there's something that science can't explain, you sort of plug your current science of ignorance with God by claiming that God did it. Here in this picture were representing our current scientific knowledge by this kind of rectangle, the Swiss cheese rectangle there on the left-hand side of the screen, and those white circles represent all our current ignorance in science, which is very big, by the way. And of course, what tends to happen sometimes, especially with certain believers, but also with the atheists as well, it happens too, and they come along, and the concept of God is really located in these present gaps in our scientific knowledge. I mean, for example, scientifically, we don't know much about the origin of life at present, nor how the first cell came into being, although we've got some pretty good ideas. But the religious believer might then be tempted to say, well, God created the first life or the first cell or whatever. But of course, what happens is that science advances very rapidly, and the gap in our scientific knowledge quickly closes. And then what happens to your idea of God? But for those who hold to a more traditional Christian understanding of God as creator, that he is the author and sustainer of all that exists, then the God of the gaps argument ceases to have any meaning. As Augustine wrote way back at the beginning of the 5th century in his wonderful commentary on Genesis, nature is what God does, or nature is what God has done. Either there is an author of creation or there isn't. Either God brought everything into being or he didn't. If he did, our current scientific ignorance about how he did it cannot possibly have any theological significance. Christians, of all people, certainly have no hidden investments in scientific ignorance. So then, what do biologists do in their research? Well, clearly what they do is to seek to describe as best they can what God does in the created order, the consequences of his ongoing program of creation, often referred to as secondary causes, God's normal way of working. And scientists do this not by invoking the actions of God, the primary cause, to explain those parts of the process which seem particularly difficult to understand, but rather by seeing the authorship of the Creator expressed in the whole biological process from beginning to end. And so clearly what we have here are two complementary narratives, with science answering the how questions. How does God bring biological diversity into existence by means of this long evolutionary process? And theology addressing the why questions as to the overall purpose and meaning of the evolutionary narrative. We cannot possibly derive our understanding of God as creator from the evolutionary process, but we can argue that the process is consistent with a creator God who has intentions and purposes for the world. So, creation or evolution, do we have to choose? As you can tell by now, I don't think so. I think we can enjoy both the beauty and the taste of the ice cream at the same time. Well, I'm sure, and I hope indeed that's all left you with plenty of questions, and I'm hopeful also you might find some answers to some of your questions, at least, in my books entitled Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? And Is There Purpose in Biology? And let me give you a tip that the cheapest place to buy those books, and indeed other good books on science and religion, is from the online shop of the Faraday Institute here in Cambridge. So I'm just going to leave that slide up for a few moments in case you'd like to jot down that information. But in the meantime, many thanks for listening. Thank you.